I'm Jonathan Goell. Look at these 3 photographs. All were made within a few minutes of each other. They were taken from exactly the same spot with the same camera, and yet each looks different. How are they made? Well, this one was made with the normal lens that came with this camera. The next was made with a wide-angle lens on the same camera, and the other was made with a telephoto lens, also on the same camera. These lenses and the pictures that you can make with them are the subject of this show, a lens. A lens is just a very finely made, polished glass object whose job it is to collect light rays that reflect off your subject out there, and it then takes those light rays and focuses it as a clear image onto the film. If you could see a cross-section of a lens, well, I happen to have a cross-section of a lens right here. This is what it would look like. This is a 3-element lens. Lenses have 5, sometimes 10, or even 15 separate elements, each a different shape, each a different size, and the purpose of all of those elements is simply to make sure that the image focused on the film is as sharp and as distortion-free as possible. Now, many starting photographers often tend to feel, wow, if I only had that super multi-coded zoom, telephoto, macro close-up extracurricular lens, that I'd be able to take those beautiful photographs that I've always wanted to take. That's not so, and it's a real trap, this love affair that people have with classy equipment. Most photographers, you'll find, the really good ones, rely on relatively few lenses, and sometimes just one lens for most of their work. And they know that people really take the pictures, not the cameras. So learn to take pictures with the lens that you have. Use your ingenuity. Bring everything that you can to the use of that normal lens. Push it to its extreme limits. You might be very, very surprised by the quality of the pictures that you get. Now, in photography, the terms wide-angle lens and telephoto lens are almost self-explanatory. The term normal lens isn't, but it doesn't necessarily mean that other lenses are abnormal. Well, what makes a normal lens normal? Come and take a look at a picture that was made with a normal lens. What do we have? Well, a man in a piano factory. It was made with the normal lens on the camera, and there are no particular distortions or special exaggerations in this photograph. Everything has a kind of a normal and an expected look to it. Normal lenses see things pretty much as our eyes do. Our eyes have an angle of vision that is the sharp area, not including the peripheral vision, of about more or less 50 degrees like this. And so does the normal lens on the camera, 50-degree lens. The way the manufacturers give a lens like this a 50-degree angle of view is really quite straightforward. In the 19th century, working photographers learned that some lenses, as opposed to other lenses, tended to give their photographs a more sort of a realistic or natural, familiar, or a normal look. And it turned out that if the measured distance from the lens to the film was about the same as the diagonal of the film that was used with this camera, the lens would produce those expected, quote-unquote, normal pictures. Now, the distance from the lens to the film is called the lens's focal length, and it is measured always with the lens focus set at infinity. That's the closest you can get a lens to the film and still have it focus sharply on a distant object. Now, for example, take this 35mm camera. 35mm, of course, refers to the size of film that this camera takes. And here's a particular frame of it right here. The frame I'm going to measure. Well, of course I'm going to measure it. Here's a ruler. If I measure from corner to corner, just the image and not the sprocket hole area, I get 44 millimeters. Now, I would expect that the normal lens for this camera would be approximately the same, or at least similar to that. Well, let's look at the lens. The lens has a little legend up here that says f equals 50 millimeters. That only refers to the focal length. You've probably heard the term f-stop. The f on the front of the lens never refers to that word f-stop. It always refers to the focal length of the lens. Now, lenses in the 45 to 55 degree range can be considered normal, of course, but only for 35mm cameras. If your camera is a 120 roll film camera, such as this twin lens reflex camera here, You would expect, of course, that the film is larger, so the diagonal is greater and the focal length would be longer. Well, let's see. Let's measure this frame of 120 film, corner to corner, and see what happens. I get, well, 80 millimeters. And it just so happens, if you look at the lens, the taking lens of this camera, that it says f equals 75 millimeters. It's the normal lens for this camera, and it's about the same length as the diagonal of the film that goes into it. Now here's the same man in another photograph. It looks different again than the first picture. What's going on in it? Well, for one thing, if you compare it to the first one, there's a lot more in that photograph. You can see more of the piano that he's working on. In fact, you can see the vise and the hammer, which are the tools that make up his trade. You can also see more windows in the background and more of the shop. You also have very strong sweeping angles and a receding perspective in this picture. And additionally, the subject appears to be much further away from us than in the first photograph. And yet, the camera was in exactly the same spot for both pictures. How is this achieved? Very simply, by putting a wider angle view lens onto the camera. How's that done? Well, this particular camera is a single lens reflex camera, and you can interchange lenses on it. I'll take out the normal lens, take the wide angle lens here, remove its rear lens cap, and snap it into place. Just, by the way, to protect the other lenses, I'll put the rear lens cap back on. Now, this is a 28 millimeter lens. This means that, because the film and lens are closer together, that I can get a much wider angle of view. And in this case, instead of getting a 50-degree angle of view, such as I got with the 50 millimeter lens, I now get a 75-degree angle of view. If I hold it here, you can see, of course, that this lens would take in a much wider angle of view. It takes in much more information, much more of the outside world, more things you can get. And it matches not only what our eyes see, including the sharp part, but also part of the peripheral vision. So the wide-angle lenses see many more things than you can actually see yourself. They certainly take in a lot more than the normal lens. Now, when would you choose to use such a wide-angle lens? Let me answer that by showing you some photographs. This is a spiral stairway in the Vatican Museum in Rome. Well, I wanted to take this picture and get the whole sweep of this beautiful stairway. I had a normal lens on the camera. When I looked down, all I could see was this center portion here. I wanted the whole sweep, so I took off the normal lens, put on the wide-angle lens onto the camera, aimed over the side, and made the picture. If I had wanted to get this with a normal lens, I'd have been in real trouble, because there was not another stairway above me, and I'd have had to have climbed on a trapeze, which wasn't installed in the museum that day, to have gotten this shot. Now, wide-angle lenses, or pictures taken with wide-angle lenses, are often characterized by extreme distortions of perspective. Look at the way the balustrade here, the boards on the floor, have this sweeping, exaggerated angle into the distance. Look how exaggerated the chair is. I took this picture with a lens that had a 100-degree field of view. That's an extreme wide angle. It gave us a feeling of very strongly receding space. I wanted to give the sensation of everything looking out to sea, the lonely chair, the old deck on this gray day. The wide-angle lens was perfect, and I couldn't get any further back anyway because this balustrade continued behind my neck, which was I was leaning on it, in fact. Now, wide-angle lenses are often used by photographers as a standard lens for general photography. There's a really good reason for that. Sometimes if things are happening, breaking very fast in front of you, and you don't have time to focus, you want to take advantage of the wide-angle lens's wide angle of view and its great depth of field to just work quickly. In this case, I was at a party, things were going on, and this fellow's dog, all of a sudden interested in what I was doing with my camera, jumped up at me, and without even raising the camera to my eye, I held it out in front of me almost in defense and snapped the picture. And I knew that because I had a wide-angle lens, that some part of the dog would finally wind up in the picture. Well, I have this nice, so rather strange random composition, characteristic of pictures like this, taken under such situations. The wide-angle lens permitted it. Wide-angle lenses can also be used sometimes to make a special point. That is, you can create a graphic relationship between things that are far away and things that are close to you and relate them. This picture was made by John Carnamola in Australia, and he wanted to make a picture which would say something about the drought conditions of that year. So he took this water truck and put it up on a bluff, and then got down below on the parched area near the desert section, got his camera near to the ground with a very wide-angle lens, and in the same field of view was able to get both the parched earth shown very sharply, and the truck in the distance also shown very sharply because of the inherent and great depth of field of wide-angle lenses. Particularly because that lens was so wide, he could get close enough to the parched earth, really near to it, to show the extreme, the crackiness of the earth and all the texture of that dried-out soil. For 35mm photography, typical wide angles tend to be, the ones you might consider which are not very expensive in price, 35mm lenses and 28mm lenses. Those would be wide-angle focal length lenses. Really wide lenses, such as 24mm and shorter, special fisheye lenses, are expensive, and they are considered usually special-purpose lenses, but I'd like to show you one just the same. This one was made by Frank Siteman of his dog. He used a fisheye lens such as this, and the distortion that you get with this particular kind of a lens, well, in fact, if you walked up to anybody with a real wide-angle lens and got this close, you'd get this kind of exaggerated distortion. The fisheye lens, in addition, adds this special curve. That is, it tends to see the world as a series of curves rather than straight lines. It presents a special picture, and you use it to achieve special effects. Now remember, the lower the focal length number that's written on the lens, the wider the angle of that lens. Now you might want to check out what a wide-angle lens would do for you, even without having one, and that's very simple. You can use a little cutout viewing frame, such as this, which I seem to have mangled in my pocket, and hold it up to your eye, or I'd really recommend taking an old slide and cutting out the frame and using it like this. It's the same size as the film, of course, and if you hold this slide frame, we'll say about 1.5 inches from your eye like this, you'll get a view which simulates that from a 28mm lens. You could walk around, create special relationships between things near and far, and you could also compare this against the view of a normal lens by pulling it out to about 2.5 inches from your eye. Come on over here to the other 3 pictures. Well, now there are only 2 on the board. I want to make yet another distinction for you. Now look at this. This 3rd picture is yet again different from the other 2. What do you see? Well, the workman now is magnified for us. The workshop is almost totally excluded. All we can see now is a part of a window. The focus and our attention is clearly riveted on this man. There's nothing else to look at. We can also see, of course, the details of the drill in his hands a little more sharply. We seem to be closer to the person. He's closer to us. It's a more intimate-looking picture, and yet the camera was on its tripod in exactly the same spot as for the other pictures. And this ability to magnify and to isolate distant subjects, or even near subjects for that matter, is the special province of the telephoto lens. In making this picture, I took the wide-angle lens off of the camera, and I took a telephoto lens and snapped it in its place. Telephoto lenses, by the way, are recognizable physically because they're simply longer than other lenses. Let me just put the back cap on this lens for protection. Now, the angle of view of this particular lens is 25 degrees. It happens to be a 105mm lens, which makes it twice as long as a normal lens. 25 degrees would look, something like this. Watch as I transfer it to the lens. The normal lens would take in that. Such long lenses tend to enlarge the subject of any subject that you look at it. In this case, this long lens magnified twice over the size of the subject as it was seen to be in the original first photograph. Now, when would you choose to use a long focal length lens such as this? Well, let's look at some pictures made with long focal length lenses. The real correct term, I should tell you, is not long focus lens, even though it happens to be, but telephoto lens. This picture was made by Terry Walker. It's a characteristic picture that you'd want to use a telephoto lens for. Why? Well, they're often useful for photographing things that are very far away that you cannot or dare not get close to photograph. I think he used maybe a 500 millimeter lens from a great distance to photograph this owl. Had he gotten too close to it, he might have invited a peck from the beak. Telephoto lenses of moderate strength are also very useful for portraits, and this was discovered also in the 19th century. That is, it's much easier to take a close-up picture of someone if you don't have to climb on their lap to do it. This photograph of Judge Learned Hand was made by Philippe Halsman, and he used a long focus lens like this, probably with a much larger camera than this. He didn't have to climb on the judge's knees to take the picture. He could stand back at a very respectful distance of several feet and yet still get a dramatic frame-filling picture. Long focus lenses also prevent distortions of things like noses in portraits, and they also, because long lenses have very shallow depth of field, allow you to throw the background out of focus so that it does not conflict with the main subject. Here's a photograph by Bill Brandt. Brandt made this picture in England of urban housing, and I think what he wanted to show was the sameness and perhaps the drabness and boring quality of all of the houses that were there. It's very confined and restricted, so he got a great distance away and trained a long lens on this scene. What happened? Well, do you remember how the wide-angle lens had a tendency to exaggerate the distance between near and far things? Now we have, say, a house back here and another one here, which is maybe 150 feet closer, 200 feet closer, and it doesn't look that much further away. The space has been compressed. The roofs have been made into a pattern, a repeated pattern. And it helps complete the statement about the repetitiousness, perhaps, of all of that kind of housing. This photograph was made by Lane Stewart for Sports Illustrated, and it shows one really great use for telephoto lenses, and that is in covering sports events. You wouldn't want to be out this close to the action with a normal lens because you'd run the risk of getting run over. So you stand on the sidelines with your long lens and you pick off the action as you see it from a great distance. And typically, again, of the long focal length lenses, the background, again, has been thrown out of focus. Now remember, the higher the number of the focal length, the higher the focal length number, the stronger the telephoto effect is going to be. And you can experiment again with this telephoto vision by using the same viewing frame. Have I lost it again? Oh, here it is. This time, instead of holding it close to your eye, hold it far away from your eye, perhaps 4.5, 5 inches, and you'll get a view which simulates that of the 105 millimeter lens. With it, you can pick out and magnify, pretend you're magnifying, particular details. Take imaginary pictures like this, and then bring it back to your eye if you want to take or to experiment with simultaneously a wide-angle and a telephoto version of the same scene. To make this picture of different lenses even sharper for you, if you'll forgive the expression, look at this. This drawing shows us a cutaway of a camera and a lens, and it shows a normal lens. The normal lens has an angle of view of about, now that's very roughly, about 50, get it straight, John, there it is, degrees. Now compare that with the wide-angle lens. The wide-angle lens, because it's somewhat closer to the film now, in this case it's the 28 millimeter lens, has a wider field of view. In this case, it's 75 degrees. Wow, you can see the difference right away. The telephoto lens, coming up. Isn't this a nice way to show it? The telephoto lens, much longer of course, has a much narrower field or a narrower angle of view. In this case, about, and that's about 25 degrees like that. At a glance, you can see the difference. Now, I want to repeat something I said before, and I can't stress it often enough. A normal lens on the camera can do a great deal of work for you. All you have to do is use your ingenuity and really push it to its limits. I wouldn't even consider buying another lens for a camera until you've really thought that you have exhausted those possibilities. After a while, of course, you'll have a sensation or a feeling for wanting another particular kind of lens. You'll know. For example, if you find that you can never get yourself close enough to a subject so that you can magnify it to a large size in the frame, you'll know that maybe it's about time to go out and consider a telephoto lens. I would recommend, by the way, that you go out and try to buy a second-hand lens rather than a new one. Save yourself a little money. You'd expect a good second-hand lens to be roughly half the list price of a new lens. Now, on the subject of getting close to a subject, even with a normal lens, wait, watch this. This photograph of our same workman in the same factory, he was in the same place, was made with a normal lens on this camera. Now, the lens barrel only focuses down to about 2 feet on this camera, and it's not enough to allow me to get that close to him. And I didn't crop the picture in enlargement either. This is what I did. I dug into my camera bag and I pulled out a close-up auxiliary lens. It magnifies things like that. And it has a threaded part here which fits this particular lens. I was then able to go right up to the subject. I didn't stay in the same place for this one. And I got about 4 inches away or 5 inches away from his face, focused carefully, gently set off the shutter for the shot. Now, close-up lenses are very inexpensive, and they have a numbering system which helps you to figure out how strong they are. For example, the weaker lenses have lower numbers, +1, +2. The stronger lenses have higher numbers. That's simple, +4, +8. This particular one is a +4, and the +4 really refers to +4 diopters, which happens to be an optician's term which is used to rate the strength or the magnifying power of a lens. And incidentally, they make the lenses stronger by increasing the rate of curve of the lens. Now, if you have a single lens reflex camera such as this, which means that you can see through the lens, you can experiment with a closer up world without actually going out to buy one of these yet, by using a simple household desk magnifier such as this. Just hold it in front of the lens, center it like that, and then look at a subject. There you go. And you get a really dramatic sudden close-up, as a matter of fact, and these lenses are a lot of fun. Now, they might not be quite as sharp as a specially designed close-up lens, but they do work. Go out and try it. It's easy. For the front of your lens, I'd like to recommend something very special. It's called a skylight filter. This is what it looks like. It's clear glass. It's almost clear glass. It has a very slight warm tint to it. And the purpose of that warm tint is to filter out, so that it doesn't reach the film, the ultraviolet light which is always out there in daylight. Now, we cannot see ultraviolet light, but the film registers it as a visible tone, sometimes in ways you don't want. It might haze out or fog out a distant landscape. If you're photographing in color, it might make that landscape more blue than you really saw it. So the use of such a filter will cut out a little bit of the haze, a little bit of the ultraviolet light. Not a lot, but enough to warm up the picture. It also has another really handy use, and that is it can protect the lens. Now, as you probably already know, lenses are subject to getting fingerprints practically out of the blue. They also tend to collect on them pollution and other sorts of dirt and grime, and a skylight filter attached to it will collect all of that dirt for the lens and then protecting it. They happen to be threaded, exactly like the close-up lens was, and you can, in fact, if you want to, thread other items into the front of these. In this case, a lens shade, which I always recommend, by the way, for general use. And the lens shade will protect the lens not only from too much extra light from the side hitting it, which would cause flare, but it can also protect the skylight filter itself from hard knocks in case you bang into something. Now, in later shows, I'll talk to you a little bit more about special black and white contrast filters or special color correction filters. That'll come later on. The thing that I think you need to really know about now, though, is how to care for and how to clean your lens. If you don't keep a lens very clean, you will get pictures which are less sharp and less crisp than you really have a right to expect from your equipment. Let me show you how. The first things you need are, of course, lens cleaning tissue, perhaps a very nice camel's hair brush, and lens cleaning fluid. Now, many people have a tendency when they're using this material. By the way, I would not recommend using things like undershirts and your tie to clean a lens. It's a very fast way to knock it out of commission entirely. Take out a few sheets of paper like this, and without ever touching the actual surface, wad it up and then take a single drop of the fluid, put it on the surface of that, and very lightly, without putting much pressure on the lens at all, just letting the springiness of the paper do it, clean off your lens, and follow that immediately with a single sheet like this to dry it off. You can also use sheets like this to brush off a lens if you don't happen to have one of these, which is pretty handy. It's also useful to do it on the finder, like this. And if you happen to have a rangefinder camera such as this, what you can really do to clean this, because it's a little hard to get into the little cracks and things with the tissue, is take a Q-tip and do it like this. If you want to breathe on it to do it, just make sure that the lens remains moist while you actually move the cleaner around. In the remaining few minutes, I'd like to show you some pictures which have been made to have a particular look by the kind of lens that was used on it. This first picture is of one-time heavyweight champion Joe Louis, and of course this was made by Art Kane. Well, not of course, you wouldn't know that unless I told you, but he used a wide-angle lens to take this dramatic picture. You can tell it's wide-angle because the fists are so exaggerated in size, and yet both the fist and the face are quite sharp. And you really get a sense for the strength of this man and perhaps the feelings that he has. This picture obviously has to be a telephoto photograph. It's taken from a great distance away. You couldn't follow a bird this fast with a normal lens unless you could run a lot. In any case, Terry Walker, who made it, used an extremely high-powered telephoto lens. I suspect maybe 400 or 500 millimeters in focal length. And he panned with the subject, by the way, using a long exposure to get that blurry effect. The last picture by J. Maisel is of a youth, and it's a good example of a really nice telephoto portrait. The background is thrown out of focus. It also is made in soft light, which is nice, and it has a very gentle look. And you know that J. Maisel wasn't sitting inches away from the boy in order to get this close-up effect. Go out, enjoy photography, use your normal lens, push it to the fullest use you can, and if you feel like it, get another lens someday, but enjoy yourself, and see you next time.